Okay, it's 4 o'clock p.m. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harald Oberhofer. I'm hosting today's FIW-Trade Talk. As you might recall from previous editions of this series, the FIW-Trade Talk is an online series in which we aim at discussing recent trade policy and international trade topics with international experts, and the FIW-Trade Talks are financially supported by the Austrian Federal Ministry for Digital and Financial Affairs, for which we are very grateful. Before jumping into our topic of today, let me just briefly remind you about kind of the housekeeping rules for this session. So the plan for the overall trade talk would be, as usual, that it takes not more than 1 hour, and we start by an 15 to 20 minutes input from our guest of today, whom I want to introduce in a couple of seconds, and this will be followed by a kind of interview discussion between our guest, who is Hylke, and myself, and you can participate in this discussion by using the Q&A button here in Zoom. Please just post your questions, comments in there, and then I will bring them to our discussion. So that's the plan in terms of the housekeeping rules. With any further delay, I would now like to move on with our topic of today. FIW's trade talk of today is entitled Pandemics, Climate Change, and Identifying Taste Shocks. So the first part, as I understand, of this session will be that our guest will talk about how we can identify taste shocks in the context of demand for international trade models. And then we're going to have a broad discussion on what we can do with this identification, as well as with taste shocks and taste in general, in terms of understanding what happens in international trade out there. With this, I would like to introduce our guest. I'm very happy that Hylke Vandenbussche is with us today. Hylke, thank you very much for being with us today. It's a great honor to have you with us. Hylke is one of the most well-established scholar in international trade and international economics in Europe. At least I would say she's professor in international trade at the Department of Economics of University of Leuven, as some of you might know, which also is called the Catholic University of Leuven. Hylke started her academic career in UK, actually, Cambridge University, afterwards moved to the US also for a while, to Dartmouth College. She worked in Tilburg, Warwick, the London School of Economics. So she already has a long history at very well-established international universities. Her research focus lies in firm-level trade and the role of demand. This is the topic of today, as well as input-output linkages, global value chains, and its interactions with trade policy. Hylke is also very active in terms of policy consultancy. She's a research fellow at the Centre of Economic Policy Research. She's also affiliated with the National Bank of Belgium, and she also did a lot of work for the European Commission on trade policy. With this, I would like to hand over to you, Hylke. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Harald, for your introduction. Let me try to share my screen so you can see the slides that I have prepared for you for the talk of today. Indeed, like you said, Harald, the challenge today is to talk about consumer taste in trade. And of course, we want to know, or people may want to know, how potentially this could also, have an effect or help us to see what might be going on after taste shocks, such as, climate change may induce taste shocks, or a pandemic may result in taste shocks. And then, if that is the case, or at least that's what some people expect, you need metrics to measure taste shocks. And this is where I think in the international trade literature, we have not moved very far. So this is, if you like, maybe not a first attempt, but one of the first attempts to try to see if we can somehow measure consumer taste and how we could do that, but from a very pragmatic point of view. I mean, we started with a structural model to try and estimate consumer taste, but very quickly we realized that people would say that this could be functional form dependent. And so we wanted to get away from this. But before I go into that, let me first give you a little bit of the context and of the research question. This is what we teach our students, so we should give the good example. What is the research question in this paper? Well, we wanted to know how important are taste differences across countries? And secondly, can we measure taste, but at a very disaggregate level? So at the level of the trade flow in micro trade data. So as you may know, there is some literature in the industrial organization field of economics where people have tried also to capture taste, but typically these studies have much more information than trade economists would have. They would know a lot about product characteristics, for example. But in trade, we typically have trade flows and that's it. And by that we mean we know how much a country ships to another country, or a firm ships to another country, or whatever it is that a firm at the level of the products ships to another country. And that's about it. So we have volumes, we have prices, we have trade flows, but that's about it. So the purpose of this paper is to try and use this type of data and yet come up with a measure of taste that we think is going a step further than what the current literature is trying to do. Now, consumer taste is very easily confounded with aspects of quality. And the question is, why do you need a different measure than quality? I mean, some people would say, why can't we stop at the firm level and just say, whenever we have a measure of firm appeal, is that not the end of the story? Why do we need to go deeper? Well, I think in the course of this paper, we will show that, taste can actually vary quite a lot between products within a firm. So that would plead for, going for a measure at the level of the product, at least, or firm product. And secondly, we will also show that the dimension of taste can be very different than quality. So, for example, I always give the example, if you line up 10 beers with the same alcohol percentage and you blindfold a test panel of people and you ask people which is the beer they love most, probably, many people will choose a different type of beer, even though you might, offer these beers at the same price, and you would almost, in terms of ingredients, they would be very, very similar. So we think consumer taste is a very different aspect than product quality, and our metric will also show this. But of course, we first need to measure before we can say something about the international dimension. Does it vary by country taste, or does it vary by product, or does it vary over time? In this paper, we mainly will focus on the variation at the level of the firm product country. So the time variation, while we have information on that, we postpone till later, because taste tends to be something that is quite persistent over time, actually. I will show you later on. Harold asked me to give a 20-minute introduction, so I will not take too long. We can go over some of the aspects in the interview later on. So that's basically our objective. We want to develop a new method to identify consumer taste at the level of the trade flow. And as I said, in future, this can be used to identify taste shocks after big shocks like a pandemic or a climate change. And further, also, our next thing on the agenda would be to see how consumer taste is going to matter for export entry. Because up till now, the literature has only focused on firm productivity or firm product productivity. And we think that is an important part of the story, but not the entire story. typically, international trade models, what we call the workhorse models in trade, do not consider demand heterogeneity across countries. And this is where it will get interesting for policy implications, because if you want to say something about product standards, for example, that differ across countries, you need a model where, first of all, you allow for demand differences, demand heterogeneity across countries. And if you look at workhorse models, they typically have a CES demand type of structure where the preferences across countries are assumed to be identical in most papers. So that is something we will have to drop. We'll have to drop this assumption of demand symmetry across countries. Whenever you sell one product across different countries around the world, we are no longer going to assume that that product faces the same demand no matter where you ship it. We are going to allow demand in that destination to vary in at least two dimensions, in the taste dimension and in the quality dimension. Secondly, the relevance of this paper is also quite clear if you look at the current studies that have tried to capture or measure taste. Most studies do this where they use a residual of the demand function. So you estimate a demand function, and whatever it is that you cannot explain, whatever it is that's in the error term, you're going to say, well, that residual, the unexplained part, that's something we're going to label as, for example, taste. But of course, a residuals approach can be quite noisy, because we know that in the demand residual, there may be a lot of things, not just demand shifters like taste, but there could also be cost shifters, which you're not exactly or explicitly controlling for in your demand function. So that could be a very noisy approach, and our results or our regression results are going to show that also. So then the challenge is, how do you purge consumer taste out of this demand residual? Because surely if you estimate a demand, it will be somewhere in the residual, your taste, if you're not explicitly controlling for it. So the whole challenge then is, how do you tease it out of the demand residual? You could argue from an econometric point of view that this is important because you want to avoid endogeneity. Taste is also unobservable, so it makes it challenging to estimate. And makes it difficult to use a traditional IV approach, because with an IV, you kind of have to have a first stage where you see to what extent your instrument is correlated with the endogenous variable. But if the endogenous variable, like here, is unobserved, that's going to be difficult to do. So we use an alternative approach, and without going into too much details, we're going to use a control function approach. And basically that means you use a polynomial, which you define over at least two variables, and that include variables that are likely to be strongly correlated with the phenomenon of consumer taste. I'll show you in a second. Now, without going into too much technical details, what we did is estimate a demand function where we control for price, where we control for taste through a control function which we call lambda, and where we control for quality through a control function that we call delta. In addition, we include fixed effects, which is the gamma term here at the product destination country. And so the little q's are the shipments that every firm J ships in every product I to a particular destination country D at a particular time T. And so whatever it is that this firm ships of a particular product to a particular destination is going to be a function, obviously, of the export price that this firm is going to be setting. And mind you, that could be an endogenous variable, so we have to instrument for price. But also, there are going to be unobservables that matter here. And these unobservables is something that we cannot have, maybe one good instrument for. So we're going to use functions to approximate those. And one function is the lambda function, and that's going to be a function, a control function that proxies for taste. Just like people do in the productivity literature, where productivity is also an unobservable. And in the end, what you do is you try to proxy it with a control function. Of course, in the productivity literature, people have also taken into account the dynamics over time, which means you're going to estimate it through a somewhat different technique. Here, we're just going to say, well, these are issues we sidestep. We just want to know a first indication of what we should put in these control functions on the consumer taste side. And on the quality side, we have the literature to guide us, because that is something that people have already tried to do. Okay, so I'm going to go further, where, like I said, price will be instrumented. What do we include in the control function for taste, which is probably the most important one? Well, we use a new data set, and this data set uses national dishes, national dish ingredients. So we collected around the world for every country information on what the national dish is and what are the food ingredients in every national dish. And then we use what we call a latent semantic analysis to try to see which countries have national dish ingredients overlaps. And so we're going to take this as a proxy for how close consumer tastes are going to be. And so suppose you have a country that has stew and fries as a national dish. In that stew, you probably have beef, and in the fries, you have potatoes. And maybe in the beef stew, people use beer to make it more tasty, more flavory. So then you would have beer, beef, and potatoes as national dish ingredients. And then you're going to look around, or maybe you have several national dish ingredients, so the list can get a bit longer. And then you're going to look for countries that actually have similar national dish ingredients. And based on that, you're going to make an index. And the assumption here, the underlying assumption is when people eat similar things, the taste is going to be relatively similar. Okay. Now we can discuss it. Our analysis here is also going to be about food and beverages. So in a first instance, we're going to use trade data on food and beverages shipped out of Belgium, actually, because that's the country for which we have these very disaggregate micro-level trade data at the firm product cost destination country. Additionally, in the taste function for the lambda control function for consumer taste, we're going to include a variable which we call Z, and the Z has to be exogenous to the trade flows that firms are shipping, but still Z has to capture consumer taste for a product coming out of a country. And Z in our case is going to be how much does a country import of a particular product compared to how much it imports from that product from all over the world. Let me give you an example. As you know, let's take the example of Belgium. Belgium ships a lot of beer, ships a lot of chocolates around the world. So here the idea is going to be, let's take the example of chocolate. How much, say, does China like Belgian chocolates relative to all the other chocolates it imports from the rest of the world? If that share is large, if the Belgian import share in China of chocolates compared to chocolates from anywhere else, from Germany, from Switzerland, from whatever country exports chocolates, then we can say China seems to have a particular preference for Belgian chocolate over, say, Swiss or German chocolate. And we do that for every product. So if the Z variable, if that share is large, then we say, well, it seems that a country like China seems to have a large taste for Belgian chocolates rather than chocolates coming from anywhere in the world. Okay. Control function for quality is where we follow the literature. So some people have argued that if you want to capture quality, you should control for import prices, you should control for the GDP of the destination across all the destinations that you ship your product to. You should also control for the local GDP of the destination. And the idea is here that if a country is richer, if the local GDP is higher, firms will send higher quality products to these destinations. And then finally, we also account for firm product market share within the destination, where people have argued that higher quality typically results in higher market shares. Now, this is not new. This is existing literature, which we're just going to use also for the purpose of controlling for quality. Okay, with one eye on the time, I would say once we have these control functions, lambda and delta, which you now know how we control for consumer taste and how we control for quality, we can empirically estimate our coefficients that we think are interesting here, which is the sigma. Sigma is going to be the demand elasticity, where I forgot to say that price will be instrumented in a Hausman type of way, where you take prices to other destination than your destination D in order to avoid endogeneity. So when you estimate this demand function, you're going to get your demand elasticity, you're going to get a coefficient on your taste, and you're going to get a coefficient on your delta. With these three parameters, we can then take a next step and say, let's now back out our marginal cost. Of course, marginal cost of a product produced by a firm and shipped to a destination is also unobservable to the researcher. So given that we don't have marginal cost information, the cost at which a product is produced, we need to circumvent or find a way that allows us to back the marginal cost out of things that we can observe. What do we observe? We observe prices, export prices, and we just estimated the demand elasticity, the sigma, in our previous step. So combining these two and making use of the optimal equilibrium pricing equation, we then back out the marginal cost. Now this gives us three parameters which are going to determine the rest of the paper, because we have marginal cost, we're going to have an estimate of taste, and we're going to have an estimate of quality at the JIDT level for every product, meaning for every firm, product, country, destination. Okay, a little bit on the data. We use Belgian export data. We have our national dish similarity. And then, you know, this is a table that shows you the number of observations that we have equals about 100,000 when we look at trade flows in food and beverages from Belgium all over the world. If we look at the countries that have large similarity in national dish ingredients with Belgium, we find France and Ireland to be top of the list, whereas those countries, if we look at the bottom 7 countries that do not have much taste overlap with Belgium, are New Zealand and Peru, because they have very different ingredients. So these are just summary statistics. The interesting part starts, I'm just going to skip this one, is going to start here, where these quality, taste, and marginal cost indexes, here we aggregate them across continents, you could say, or parts of the world, but we have them for every trade flow. But if you aggregate them to a higher level, just to present you some data in a table that's containable, we see that the quality index doesn't vary that much across parts of the world, which is reassuring in the sense that it means that firms seem to ship similar quality around the world. So there's not so much evidence of quality discrimination, which some people think that firms may do. Well, we don't find it to be that much present in the data. But when you look at taste, and of course, all this is in logs, you know, the variation is much bigger. If you see, you know, taste and how that varies for Belgian products around the world, you see that in some parts of the world is very low, in other parts of the world is very high. So there seems to be a lot more variation there. And then when you look at the marginal cost, again, like I said, this is in logs, so don't worry too much about the minuses. We have some variation, but not as much as on the taste account. Now, what can we do with these indices? You can look at the correlation. For example, we find these indices to be relatively lowly correlated, which goes a little bit against the literature. We can come back to it later. And this is an interesting table. It tells us the variance decomposition. So when we look at taste, we see that it mainly varies across countries, whereas for firm quality, or for quality to cure, I should say, we see that it mainly varies across firms, even though we have 3 dimensions in our data: firm, product, and country. So taste seems to vary particularly across countries, quality seems to vary particularly across firms, and marginal cost seems to vary across the both dimensions, firm and product, but not so much across countries. And that seems quite intuitive. If you ship a bottle of beer, wherever you're going to ship it, you know, the marginal cost of producing it is not going to differ that much. So the country dimension, which here is the country of destination, doesn't get to explain a great deal. Final table that I want to show you for now, before I go to the conclusions, including some policy conclusions, is that here we do a decomposition. And this decomposition is also done in a paper by Hotman, Redding, and Weinstein, for example, but they use firm level data. They don't use firm product data, and they use functional form type of analysis. So quite different, I would say, in their analysis, but the decomposition technique is quite similar. What you do in a decomposition is you look at export revenue and you try to determine how much of the variance in that export revenue is determined by cost, is determined by quality, and is determined by taste, or, and finally, is determined by market competition, meaning the market you ship your product to. The competition can be different. Surely if you ship out French wine, the competition in Spain is going to be very different for your wine than in China, for example. So here we see that the beta coefficients, they tell us the percentage of variation in export revenue explained by each of these factors. And this is quite interesting, because now suppose you're an exporter and you want to know, what is the secret of my export success? Is it my productivity? Meaning, is it the marginal cost at which I produce, which is what all the trade models are kind of trying to capture? Or is it the demand side? Is it things like the quality that I'm offering or the taste in the local demand for my product? Well, here we get a very nice decomposition. How important is each of these factors? In the first column, we say, well, let's suppose we're ignorant about our measures of taste and quality. And suppose we look at our demand function, we do not include our control function of taste. We just take the demand residual. If you do that, that's column 1, taste seems to explain 45% of all the export revenue variation, which is huge. And this is coming back to my earlier point. In the literature, people often have used demand residuals, but the demand residual tends to be very noisy and includes a lot of information in addition to taste. So this is a proxy, but it's a very crude proxy. And, you know, it generates a result that you almost find too high to be believable. 45% of your export success explained by taste is huge. Now, what do you get if, say, you try to use the approach that we've been propagating in this paper, where you say the demand residual is just too big to use as a proxy for taste? What you want to do is you want to purge out of the demand residual the part that you think is most closely identified with taste. And that's where you have the control function. That's what we do in column 2, 3, and 4. And then you see that taste explains about 14% on average across all products of the export revenue variation. Incidentally, the 14% is about as much as the marginal cost, which is a proxy for the productivity, is explaining. Okay, so here we can say taste, as you capture it through the measure that we propose here, is as important to explain export success on average as marginal cost for these bunch of products. Whereas quality seems to stand out in every regression that we tried, in every approach that we tried, whether we use a structural model or just a very hands-on pragmatic approach as we do in this paper. Quality explains more, explains about 24-25%. So that seems the most important variable on the demand side to explain your export success, okay? And that's going to be important. Okay, gravity, very quickly. If you run a gravity model now with these new taste and quality measures, you quickly see that things change. They don't change when you add quality. So that's what we do in column 3. In column 3, we add a quality index. And then you see the distance variable doesn't change at all. But as soon as you include the taste variable, the distance drops by a lot, suggesting that when you have a good measure of taste, what does distance capture in a gravity model? Does it capture aspects of costs, Or when you go further away in space, does it actually capture the decay in demand preferences? You know, does it capture differences in taste? An open question, but our simple gravity seems to suggest it does. Very quickly, conclusions. Okay, we think we provide evidence that demand is as important for trade as the supply side, or even more. Within the demand side, quality is the most important variable, but consumer taste explains about as much as the marginal cost or the productivity side. Identifying these consumer taste and quality is important, otherwise you're going to get biased estimates on your demand estimation. If you control for taste in a gravity model, this is going to substantially reduce the coefficient on distance. So question is, what does distance capture in a gravity model? To the minimum, you could say, we showed the existence of consumer heterogeneity in space. And once you know that, a whole plethora of questions now comes to the table. Let me just give you one. If you think the world consists, as we do in most of our trade models, in identical consumers around the world, then you can never explain diverging product standards. Now, these diverging product standards, and this is where we get to the level of the WTO, they are becoming increasingly a problem in the whole area of free trade agreements. If countries conclude a free trade agreement, like the Brexit one, or like other free trade agreements, where mutual recognition is not present, this means that you're not going to accept a product necessarily with a diverging product standard coming from another country. Well, that undermines the efficiency of your free trade agreement. We can come back to this later. It's a very important point. And you can only explain that by introducing consumer heterogeneity in space. Otherwise, there is no need for diverging product standards, and you cannot give any advice to institutions like the WTO, because for an international trade economist, there would not be a problem. Demand would be symmetric around the world. Okay, let me, well, and then finally, coming back to the pandemics and climate change issue, what you, of course, could do once you have now a metric that allows you to estimate consumer taste, you can then start looking at consumer taste changes over time. And in our opinion, you know, what we already see in the pandemic is that people are starting to change their preferences, often more in the direction of locally produced products or products whereby previously they would import them, and now people are even willing to pay a little bit more, provided that it comes from close by. So these type of taste shocks is something you want to identify, but for that you need a good metric, and therefore I think we need to think about how to estimate taste more in the future. Okay. I think I went a little bit over time, Harold. I apologize. Let me stop here and see what you have to ask.
That's fine, Hylke. Thank you very much for this very interesting input and brief presentation. I already wrote down a couple of points I wanted to ask, but before I'm going to start, just a reminder to the audience, please use the Q&A section, post your questions or comments, and participate in the discussion. If you want to, I will bring your questions to our table then. But maybe I want to start with the first point. The first point would actually directly relate to what you have said at the end of your presentation on diverging product standards, because I thought that's very interesting and that could also be very relevant from a trade policy perspective. And given that you now have estimates for differences in taste, have you checked whether these differences in taste are able to explain differences in product standards? Because that should empirically be possible, and I think that would be a very interesting exercise to see whether your taste measure is really helpful for understanding also policy decisions. If you, for example, find a strong positive correlation between, or negative correlation actually, between taste and product standard harmonization.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And the answer is no, we have not done any correlations between our taste measure and product standards, but it's clear that in future, this could be a potential avenue to go to see if, for example, there was this case where the European Union was importing wine, I believe, from Argentina. And at some point, there was a blockage of the import because the product standard that the EU imposed was that the high level of alcohol present in the Argentinian wine was not in the interest of the health of the European people. So that is one example where a country or a trade bloc like the EU in that case can block imports from another country based on a product standard that argues that a set of consumers, like European consumers, their health would be negatively impacted by the consumption of this product. And then this product standard becomes one way to block imports unilaterally from another country. So you're quite right. These product standards are crucial for trade policy because if of course, in a free trade agreement where you have this mutual recognition like the EU has with Japan, you would never have this kind of problem because the EU and Japan agreed beforehand, in this free trade agreement, we are going to respect each other's product standards. So whatever is good enough for the Japanese consumers, in Europe, we're going to consider as good enough for the European consumers. So we're not going to argue with your product standards. Sure. Not every free trade agreement has this, like Brexit doesn't have that. So ultimately, at some point the UK could say, look, whatever French wine we're importing from France with an alcohol percentage above, 10% is not good for the health of the UK people. So we're going to block it, which would then be perfectly legal in the context of WTO rules that says if you have diverging product standards based on environmental health issues or, other sets of issues that are specific to the country and to the country's consumers, you are allowed to block unilaterally the imports of another country, even if that country has an FTA with you, as long as you don't have mutual recognition, that's still possible. As you can imagine, this may undermine the efficiency of free trade agreements and is going to be an area of potential conflict if countries are going to abuse these product standards for their own interests. And then it becomes a tool of industrial policy, mimicked or under the mask of trade policy, but the ultimate goal is the same. You want to protect your market from foreign imports. So then what is the purpose of the FTA, where you're supposed to have free trade between the two partners?
Sure, totally agree. And I like your example on wine and alcohol, because actually already back in the 80s, right, we had this case in the European Union on Cassis de Deschamps, which was actually just the important case that made the point clear that we have mutual recognition within the European Union. But from a policy perspective, this is kind of a difficult statement or difficult to disentangle things, right? Because as you mentioned at the end on this diverging product standards, this can also be driven not by differences in taste, but rather by lobbying of specific interest groups that wanted to have protectionistic measures somehow, right? So, and then it would not actually be a direct taste effect that leads to diverging product standards, but rather interest groups and trade policy, protectionistic trade policy for just protecting the market for the local suppliers, right? Is there a way to differentiate this somehow? It's difficult, isn't it?
That would be very difficult. What would be the outcome of, but the question is, maybe it doesn't matter too much. I think what matters is if the WTO allows it. And then for whatever reason, how the product standard comes about, be it through lobbying or be it through, and probably you're right, I guess in most cases it will be lobbying, because in the end, take the example of the French wine. I mean, who would ask for such a product standard? Probably the UK alcoholic market, and they would benefit from it, because if you can push out imports from, say, France, the market share for your alcoholic beverage may go up in the UK. So you have an interest in lobbying the government based on these WTO rules that these high alcohol percentages would not be good in the interest or in the health of the people, to try and keep imports out. As I said, it becomes a measure of industrial policy that is giving a tool or an instrument in the hands of domestic lobbyists.
Right. Very interesting. Thanks. We now have some first questions, and since they are also related to methodological aspects, I would directly bring them to our discussion. So the first one is from Manfred Schickerling from the Austrian Federal Ministry of Digital and Economic Affairs, and he states, quote, "Very interesting. Could this approach be used to redefine consumer rent, where he means the benefits consumers derive from imports by allowing them to buy products, the quality of which they prefer over what is available locally?"
I believe so. There is also a small literature actually going in that direction. I mean, now we are in our models and in our indices, again, assuming in international trade that whenever you import a variety, the quality is going to be similar than the quality that you have of the domestic variety, and vice versa. But of course, that does not need to be true. So as soon as you allow that assumption to be loosened, you will get also different indices, different price indices, for example. And so that might, again, give you a different measurement of what the welfare aspects are going to be, because switching to a foreign variety, if you assume the quality is going to be the same, is surely going to be different than the welfare aspects involved in switching to a foreign variety when the quality is higher or lower. But at least you need a measure of that quality and quality difference, or of the taste quality difference, because I think this argument has been made for quality issues. So people are aware that in international price indices, these quality differences between domestic varieties and foreign varieties may play a role, but nobody so far has pointed out that the same similar argument could go for consumer taste. As soon as so now what we do in our models, we assume implicitly that the taste for the variety, wherever this variety is coming from, foreign or domestic, that the taste is identical. But suppose that's not the case. Again, then you get different welfare issues, provided you have a measure to capture this and to adjust your price indices accordingly.
Thanks a lot. So the second question is also related to the methodological part. In this it centers around the data you are using, and actually it seems to be that we have an expert in beer markets here. So Johannes is asking, your analysis is based on trade data, but trade data shows delivery point to first customer. In case of Anheuser-Busch and the Belgium Hoegaarden beer, it could be produced in Czech Republic and delivered to an Austrian distributor, showing a Czech-Austrian trade. Have you taken this into account?
Yes, I'm not a beer expert, but I can say this. The data that we use means that beer has to come from Belgium. Okay, so it could be produced elsewhere. What the question asker seems to suggest, it may well be, but in our data we observe the trade flow of a Belgian firm shipping beer to any country in the world. Which brings me to the second point in the question. It's true that we don't have data that go directly to the consumer of that beer in the country that is shipped to. We have this representative consumer idea in international trade. Why? Because our data are not fit to go beyond, which is why in our models we use this idea of a representative consumer, meaning one consumer per country, because our data are exactly that. You ship as a firm your beer to a country, to say China, but you don't know which Chinese consumer is going to, in the end, drink your beer. The only thing you know is how much you deliver to China. So this is why in our models, we're going to assume that China can be captured through one consumer. And we're going to assume that this one representative consumer has more similar, so, that all Chinese consumers are relatively the same, but that they can be very different from, say, German consumers. That's a little bit what we do in international trade. We assume one representative consumer per country, which is, of course, a simplification, because ideally you want to talk about consumer heterogeneity within a country. And in that sense, it's a very good question, and I should qualify. When I say on my last slide, this paper is about consumer heterogeneity, I should say this is about international consumer heterogeneity in space, because we don't have information on consumer heterogeneity within a country, unfortunately. Otherwise, we could go deeper. But because our data are Belgian exports to a particular country, this is where we stop. So all the models are going in the direction of a representative consumer. So here, consumer heterogeneity means consumer heterogeneity across countries, not within a country.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for clarifying this point. Maybe just the last question on the methodological points from my side. Let's see if there are more later on. And then maybe I would like to move to the big topic of pandemics and climate change, and what we can do with this estimates for taste difference and taste shocks. My methodological question would be about, so far you're basically using the idea that you can identify a metric for taste based on the idea that consumers with similar taste consume similar dishes, and for consuming similar dishes, they are consuming similar ingredients for those dishes, right? So that's the idea somehow for your control function approach. And I think that's perfectly fine for all agricultural products and trade in agriculture. The question is how general this approach would be for example, durable consumer goods, which are an important aspect of the whole pandemic and change in demand and preferences for durable consumer goods. So I think the idea would be to find something similar, but I guess that's much more complicated, isn't it?
Yes, I think the first thing you could do is try and see whether our measure is still capturing something, even in different products. Personally, we believe it does. And this is based on other type of research where people have shown that what you eat is very often also an indication of other types of consumption. Of course, maybe not all. And so the question then becomes, where does the use of the instrument stop? For what type of products does it perform well? And for what type of products you really need to look for a different instrument? I think for food and beverages, there is very little discussion of whether, national dish ingredients could be a good measure. We have tried a bunch of others, such as cultural distance between countries, but these data is not very, very good. They're really in need of an update, I would say. Also, we looked at whether national dish ingredients, to what extent that overlaps with climate conditions, because then you don't want to capture climate conditions rather than taste. And we did some tests in the paper to show that what we argue as national dish ingredient overlap is a very different type of metric than latitude and altitude, for example. So the climate conditions, although they can play a little bit of a role, they're not determining everything in this measure. But clearly for food and beverages, we think we have a good instrument. If you go to consumer durables, I would think we still have, potentially something to explain. Because in the end, taste comes together with culture, comes together with a lot of other values. I remember the work by David Atkin, for example, on the rice consumption in India and the fact that it stayed very persistent and stable over time, despite the fact that people also had other types of food available, is very indicative of some countries. But of course, if you're talking about, I don't know, laptops and mobile phones, to what extent do you need another or better instrument is probably future research, remains to be seen. But here, I guess the purpose of our paper was mainly to show consumer heterogeneity in space exists, right? And once you show it exists, then a bunch of questions come to the table that we couldn't maybe address before or even raise because the models didn't allow for the question to be raised. We measure it, I think, quite well in the food and beverage sector, but I'm sure other instruments will arise. Now, it's a little bit the same like in IO, where people do very sector-specific studies on cars or on even mobile phones or computers, where they have very specific characteristics, but these characteristics also are very different across every study, right? The instruments are never quite the same. Maybe in trade, we also need something of an approach like that. But here, at least, we have shown empirically that there is consumer heterogeneity in space. We think we have a good instrument for these type of products, and yeah, then we can take it a step further, probably in future, hopefully.
Thanks. Maybe, so we're already running out a little bit of time, but I just want to at least post one more question and then maybe come back to the question and answer section questions from the audience. My question would concern climate policy or climate change and climate policy, and the role of taste, basically, because I think that's very interesting, because we as economists quite often just think about, well, if you want to reduce the externalities from some consumption, then just get the relative prices right? Which would imply just increase prices for CO2 intense products, and then for given tastes that would be fine and that would be enough, because then the externality would be internalized and it would be a reduction in consumption of those polluting products, which should work out fine. On the other hand, as you have mentioned, you're interested in identifying taste shocks. That would imply that we also have this kind of idea that tastes or preferences might change over time. And this is also what some political parties, quite, at least in my impression, try to do by, well, having programs, initiatives, and where they just want to increase awareness, let's put it that way, right? On the negative effects of CO2 intense products, and that could change taste, right? And if I'm correct with the ingredients, with your decomposition, you would be able to basically estimate the relative effects of price increases. So classical economic tools like a CO2 tax versus those awareness programs that might change tastes, right? And so you could basically provide numbers on the effectiveness of those different approaches for dealing with a problem of climate change, right?
I think so, because price is an element in our demand equation. So if you were to introduce some kind of tax that is going on to the price, that would be picked up here potentially, and then that would be very different from the taste measure. And this is why I gave, I think, the example what you already see, the buying local campaigns, which are currently, I think, quite. I mean, this is something that I've noticed during the pandemic, that people are willing to pay more for something that's available and that is coming from close by. especially in food production. I think it was a trend already maybe observed even prior to the pandemic. But I think the pandemic is definitely a shock that is going to tilt this preference shift even more. And people will be willing to pay for certain products more than before, even without necessarily taxes being imposed. I guess we can expect, especially in some sectors, a marginal cost increase for different reasons, a cost push type of cost increase because of global value chain disruptions, which will result in higher prices. And the question is, will this affect demand a lot? It remains to be seen. For some products, maybe yes. For other products, maybe not so much. So the demand elasticities, I think, are likely to change. And they will normally, these things, I guess, only change gradually over time. But with shocks like quite sudden shocks, like a pandemic or climate change, which is quite disruptive, people's preferences could start changing quite quickly.
Yeah. I think that is maybe the most important question with regard to those different components. Of course, we need to wait for recent data to see what happened during the pandemic with respect to taste, for example, right? Because that's something else I wanted to ask. You basically said, well, in your data so far, you don't see dramatic changes in tastes, right? Well, and this is also something that we typically in standard models would assume, right? That preferences are given and we can only change relative prices somehow. But taste or preferences would not change too much.
Yes, of course, Harold. I have to point out that this is an academic study, so it means we always go back in time, and our time period is 1998-2005, and this is largely for methodological reasons. Why? Because over this period, the nomenclature of products did not change, and the industry nomenclature did not change. So the NACE definition and the product definition remained relatively stable over that period. So that's why we took this period. And during that period, we see that taste did not change very, very much. But of course, it varies country by country, because what you pick up is the taste for Belgian products. And so in some countries, it does change. In other countries, it doesn't change that much. But I'm sure if you go the period 2020 or 19 to 2023, we will see perhaps taste and preferences changing quite a bit.
Sure. Well, but here it could also be that it's not really taste, but rather restrictions. If it's difficult to purchase Chinese products due to all those disruptions in value chains and global transport, then you need to go for the more expensive local product, although taste might still be constant, right? So, and I think that's the very interesting part. So what is really taste change, and what is just restrictions increase, and then you're forced to purchase some different products over some very specific time periods. And here I think that one question of Johannes fits nicely, because he asked also on your statement with buy local. He says, well, that people want to pay more. Is that a general trend or just in rich countries? Because data from Russia show that due to inflation, they reduce high-cost products in favor of simpler and cheaper products, e.g. with alcohol.
Interesting example. Of course, I have not seen very many examples of other countries, but I do think it's a general trend, the buying local thing, whether you are in Asia, or whether you are in Western Europe, or whether you are going to be in another country. simply because of availability issues. I think you see it on many accounts that people now prefer availability to cheapness, or maybe rather than having 10 varieties all coming from abroad, you're already happy with the local variety provided you can get your hands on it. I don't know how it is in Germany, but in Belgium, if currently you're trying to do some construction works on your house and you need, for example, insulation material, it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of availability. And people will pay anything for whatever type of insulation they can get their hands on. So yeah, if the availability is just much lower, and the domestic varieties somehow are available and the international varieties are not, I think people suddenly are willing to pay more for the local variety simply due to the lack of choice. But surely, just to come back to the methodological point, in our analysis, suppose we would want to separate these things, right? Mm-hmm. We could, as long as the restrictions are at a higher level of aggregation than the firm product level, we would capture this through our fixed effects. Mm-hmm. So suppose there would be import restrictions on I don't know, the sector steel products or something. Then this gamma IDT would tell us that for all steel products shipped to a particular country, there would be maybe some restrictions. But of course, don't forget, there's firm variation. So our taste measure is always at the firm product variation. So the taste measure is always measured at a more detailed level. So as long as you have variation, you should be able to capture it and to tease out these two effects, I think.
True. Thank you very much, Hylke. I'm also looking at the time right now. We're perfectly in time, I guess. It's 2 minutes after 5. We also 1 minute after 5. We also started 1 minute after 4. So we are perfectly in this 1 hour. I think we could go on this topic for hours because it's really interesting, and I think it's a very, very important additional information that you're providing with your methodology that will be very relevant for a lot of policy questions that come up in the next years to come with all the climate policies and also with dealing with the consequences of the pandemic in terms of international trade. So thank you once more for being with us today. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. And I also want to thank all of the audience for tuning in today. On Thursday morning, we have the next FIW event, which is a presentation and FIW lecture, which presents the most recent FIW policy brief, which deals with trade policy and which actually centers around this new trade policy, trade agreement in the Pacific, including China. So our CEP will be the topic. So we hope to see all of you there on Thursday. And for this, I would like to thank all of you. Thanks again, Hylke. Have a nice evening, and most importantly, stay healthy, everybody. See you.
Thank you very much. Motivates me to continue to work on this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.